Dr. Hussain is a professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses in religious studies, and his particular specialty is the study of Islam. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in religious studies from the University of Toronto. He is author of 6 books, among them one named Oil and Water, which is one that I've used in my classes, and it is a very succinct and easy to comprehend introduction to the religion of Islam. His other book, another book that he wrote, is Muslims in America, which you'll hear more about this evening if you're interested. Also, he is the author of some 60 book chapters and scholarly articles on religion in various publications. He is co-editor of A Concise Introduction to World Religions, now in its 4th edition. From 2011 to 2015, he was the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. It's a premier scholarly journal for the study of religion, and to be an editor of it is an extremely difficult honor. He is also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Religion, Conflict, and Peace, of the Ethiopian Journal of Religious Studies, and the other journal, Comparative Islamic Studies. Amir is also interested in areas of religion and music and literature, religion and film, religion and popular culture. As such, he is an advisor for the TV series The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. He is on the board of directors of the American Academy of Religion, from whence I know him, which is an organization with over 9,000 members internationally. Its purpose is to promote free inquiry, critical examination, diversity, inclusion, respect, and transparency in the study of religion. He's also a fellow at the LA Institute for the Humanities, bringing together academics and writers, musicians and dancers, curators and critics, journalists and poets to stimulate a cross-disciplinary exchange. I can continue with a long list of Dr. Hussain's awards and accomplishments, but at this point, I'm sure you can see that his work and reputation make him extremely qualified to give us a true and balanced picture of this largely misunderstood religion and its followers. Thank you. Dr. Hussain.
I lecture about every 3 semesters at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and whenever I walk into my classroom and I say, good morning, good evening, the students are completely unresponsive, and one of them says something. I remember the first time lecturing at the Academy, the topic is really this book that came out a couple of years ago. The theme that runs through the book, an extraordinary American author, the blessed Langston Hughes, a phenomenal poet. It's a poem that some of you know, his poem, I Too Sing America, Langston writes. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. That's the theme that runs through this book, looking at Muslims in America. Before I start with that, I want to start with a quote from my mentor. I was blessed to have one of the great scholars of religion, a fellow Canadian, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, as my mentor. And this is a line from probably his most famous book, The Meaning and End of Religion, where Wilfred wrote, and you see it up here, normally persons talk about other people's religions as they are, about their own as it ought to be. I love that. We know the realities of our tradition, and we know where we don't live up to the ideals of our tradition. And we look at other people and say, look at your reality, and we compare that to our ideal. That's not fair. Let's compare realities to realities, ideals to ideals. So please keep that in mind as we talk about Muslims and their connection here. And I wanted to write this book. The book came out in 2016. I wanted to write the book in 2009. One of President Obama's first speeches as president outside the U.S. was in Cairo, at Cairo University. This isn't, of course, the full text of his speech, and this was in 2009. You know, as Mara said, 2011, I became the editor of the main journal in our field, and that took my life for the next 5 years, which meant that's why the book didn't come out till 2016. But in some ways, much more relevant in 2016 than it would have been in 2009. You know, because the sort of things you're hearing, Muslims are newcomers to America. Muslims haven't done anything in America. At best, Muslims are trying to undermine America. At worst, trying to overthrow America. And you might say, that's simply not true. Let's look at the history here. You know, and that's what I started to do in this book, which is a really, I think it's one of my mother's favorite books that I've written. You know, it's very easy to read because, you know, you make your living as academic writing very dense, abstract sort of papers for fellow academics. That's not what this book is about. This book is really for the ordinary reader who wants to get some sense of what's this story? What's President Obama talking about with this background here? And then you think, okay, in the years since 2009, what can we say about American Muslims post 2009? What else have we done? Well, this guy, some of you know him, Hussain. This was his first Oscar, Best Supporting Actor for Moonlight. Won a second Best Supporting Actor for Green Book. Hussain, you know, belongs to this heterodox sect, the Ahmadiyya community. We can talk in the Q&A. And I should have said this before. My students at OMI are very good. They're very smart. They're also very honest. They tell me I can hold their attention for about 35 to 40 minutes. So I promise not to talk at you for more than about 40 minutes. We'll have lots of time for questions. We can talk about this. But here's this guy, American Muslim, convert to Islam, who's won not just one, but 2 Oscars. And just to establish my own street cred, this is an event at City Hall there. Yeah, my students don't care how many books I've written. It's like, wait, you know Mahershala Ali? Like, you've hung out with... Yeah. But if you think about, you know, what President Obama was talking about, the kinds of things American Muslims have done, I grew up a basketball fan. And for me, greatest basketball player ever, it's not Mr. James, it's not Michael Jordan, it's this guy, American Muslim, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. You know, some of you know him, and many of you may actually have known him in the picture on the left. Before he was Kareem, he was Lou Alcindor from New York, who came to California to play for the greatest coach ever, John Wooden. You know, played 3 years for Mr. Wooden's varsity because back in '67, the NCAA had this quaint idea that college was hard, that freshmen shouldn't play collegiate sports. And so Kareem only played 3 years, not 4 years. The other picture is him playing for the Lakers. If you're a basketball fan, you remember the funky Denver Nuggets uniforms. It's Dan Issel. Dan Issel's about 6'8". That gives you a sense of how big Kareem is, because the guy who's shooting over is literally 6'8". And you see that. Kareem developed that shot, that signature shot, the skyhook, at UCLA, you know. Because in '67, the NCAA outlawed dunking. Think about that for a second. It wasn't exclusively because of Kareem. It wasn't only because of Kareem. But think about that, you know. '67, you know, after '65, the assassination of Dr. King, civil rights, Muhammad Ali not being inducted in the armed forces for the Vietnam War. The next year would be the assassination of Dr. King. Very turbulent times in '67. And you got to think that the sight of large black men dunking with authority created some issues for some folks. That's why Kareem developed that shot, you know, because he couldn't just turn around and dunk it. That was illegal. They changed the rules because of them. But you look at what this guy has done, just on the basketball court. 6-time world champion, 19-time all-star, all-time leading scorer. And that's only part of his work. The man's written over a dozen books. There's athletes that haven't read a dozen books, you know. Got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. We were really privileged at LMU this year to have him as our commencement speaker. It's just lovely to see. I'm 6'2", and he's almost as tall as me, sitting down there. But it was a tremendous honor, you know, to meet one of your heroes and think, okay, what does it mean? Greatest basketball player of all time. Coach Wooden certainly called him the greatest basketball player of all time. When you factor in the 3 titles at UCLA, the 6 titles, one with the Bucks and then the 5 with the Lakers, no question that this guy is dominant. And then I think about my great hero as a kid, greatest athlete I ever saw, you know? Greatest, I think, the greatest of all time, you know, Muhammad Ali. And you think about this, like my students are very lovely, they're very smart, they're very young. They have no sense of history at all. I mean, they're 18 years old. They don't have that understanding. They know George Foreman as this lovable, jolly fat man that sells you the lean, mean growing machine on late night TV. That was not the George Foreman that I knew. You know, in 1974, I remember watching on closed circuit TV, you know, in those less enlightened times in the 70s, what was called the Rumble in the Jungle, the fight in Zaire. I wasn't afraid that Foreman would beat Ali. I was afraid that Foreman would kill Ali. I mean, that's how bad a man George Foreman was. I mean, that guy came out of Houston's Fifth Ward. Not a particularly pleasant place these days to be a young man. Certainly not in the 70s, you know. And what's Ali do? Conventional wisdom, don't let this guy Foreman hit you. What's Ali do? Lets him hit him. You know, of course he can't hit him because Ali's too quick. If you don't remember that fight, it's been time since you saw that fight, watch, there's a great documentary called When We Were Kings that looks at that fight and sort of the cultural context of that fight. But there's a great moment where they're clinching, as boxers often do, and Ali's saying something, and I never understood what Ali was saying to him until I watched that documentary. And there's Foreman giving Ali his best shot, and there's Ali in the clinch going, George, is that all you got? George, they told me you could hit. That's it? And you think about that for a second. There's George Foreman, baddest man in the world, throwing his best at Ali, and Ali's like, that's it? They told me you could punch. Foreman punches himself out. Ali wins in a technical knockout. They're extraordinary. So that's the Ali that I knew from 74. I didn't know the Ali from 67 until before that. And then you start looking at his story and think, okay, who's this young man? Cassius Clay, Louisville, Golden Gloves champion, wins a light heavyweight. Some of you may remember that. You know, 1960 in the Rome Olympics, light heavyweight gold medal in boxing. Comes back home to his hometown, Louisville. Isn't served lunch in a restaurant. Because in 1960, even though he's the Olympic champion, he's the wrong color. That's that Langston Hughes line, you know, eat in the kitchen. I'm sorry, we can't serve you here. We can serve you in the back. We can't serve you out front. Think about that. Everyone in Louisville knows who he is because he's won a gold medal for his country, our country. Can't do it. You know. Converts to the Nation of Islam. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. Doesn't reveal that until after he defeats Sonny Liston. Shook up the world, as Ali famously said. And then he says he's now a member of the Nation of Islam. He's no longer Cassius Clay. He's Muhammad Ali. If that isn't controversial enough, in 1967, as a Muslim on the principles of the Nation of Islam, says he will not fight in the Vietnam War. In 1967, that is not a popular stance. 74, much more so. 67, not so much. He's never jailed, but he loses his license, can't box for 3 years. The case ultimately goes to the Supreme Court, which sort of on a technicality says that because he wasn't given the reason for not being given a conscience objector status, that it throws out the conviction. So he's able to box again. But you think about this man and what he did. That perhaps the most famous man in the world when he died in 2016, in the pre-internet age, was an African-American Muslim. I remember in '96, the Olympics in Atlanta. Some of you remember Janet Evans, greatest American woman swimmer at that point. She had the torch last, and we all thought, oh, Janet's going to light the cauldron. This will be very cool. And then best kept secret. There's the curtain, and there's Ali. And he's holding the torch in this hand, and this hand is shaking because the Parkinson's in 96, you know. And a hush over the crowd, and I thought that was beautiful because it's come full circle. This man that was despised in 67 is beloved in 2016, in 1996. When he dies in 2016, it's a state funeral. You know, phenomenal kind of person. And here's this American Muslim who's done this as an American Muslim. And then you start thinking about, oh, why is it that these two men that I've shown you, Kareem, Ali, are African Americans? You know, if you think of Alex Haley, I was a kid when Roots came out, Alex Haley's search for his family's roots as an African American. And the earliest ancestor they could trace, Kunta Kinte, brought as a slave from the Gambia in 1732 to Annapolis. You know, if you go to Annapolis, where the academy is, about 100 yards, 200 yards up from the port, the docks, you'll see the statue of Alex Haley, sort of reading to kids. You know. And I'm looking at this going, wait, Alex Haley's ancestor, Kunta Kinte, was a Muslim? There were Muslims who were slaves? And I think, well, of course there were Muslims who were slaves. We know that Islam has been in West Africa since at least the 9th century. We brought a number of slaves over because it's much easier to bring from West Africa than from East Africa. Why are we surprised that a percentage of those West African slaves were Muslim? So you've had Muslims in this country before this country was this country, going back to the slave trade. Some of you may know this, many of you may not know this. You know, if you go to Lower Manhattan, go visit, you know, the 9/11 Memorial, go visit the museum, and then walk 6 blocks down Duane Street, the corner of Duane and Elk Street. You have this, the African Burial Ground National Monument, declared by President George W. Bush in 2007, a national monument, and opened by President Bush in 2007. Discovered in 1991, so you see the top black and white picture. Lower Manhattan, as they're often doing renovations, building, rebuilding, as they're doing some construction work, they discover these graves. And you have to stop, of course, what are these graves? Then they realize that those graves are the graves of African slaves who are buried there. Because, of course, Lower Manhattan, a port, a dock, many slave ships docked in Lower Manhattan. Lots of slaves there. And so you think, oh yeah, there were African slaves there. Some of whom, 10% from West Africa, not 10% of the slaves, but 10% of the West African slaves were probably Muslim. You know, so there are Muslims here. You know, many of you remember the controversy, you know, a few years ago now, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, you know, the Muslim community wanting to build Cordoba House, a mosque there, and people saying, you can't build a mosque here, this is sacred ground, 3,000 Americans, you know, were killed here by 19 Muslim hijackers. Then you start thinking about this, and, okay, if it's the ground, if it's the dead in the ground that make the ground sacred, what about those who were there long before the terrorist attacks of 9/11? The fact that there's Muslim slaves there in the soil of Lower Manhattan, you know? We know this from the things they're buried with. We know this from the accounts. There are a number of accounts of Muslim slaves. This is one of them, and I bring this up just simply because this is Muhammad Bakakwa, who escapes from a Brazilian slave ship that's in one of the docks in Lower Manhattan. And his story is written. So this is literally like a Muslim slave whose escape is through New York, whose story gets told. Another one, Joe bin Solomon. In 1730, Joe bin Solomon is brought to Annapolis, you know, same place where Alex Haley's ancestor was brought. He gets his freedom in part because the slave owner realizes that he's literate in several languages, including Arabic. It's this really interesting story that's told by a clergyman from the Church of England in a book that's published in London in 1734. So think about that for a second. In 1734, people in London are reading about a Muslim slave in the Americas. If you know your American history, in 1734, General Washington, the father of our country, is a 2-year-old, a toddler. You know, that's what I'm talking about, the history that goes back to before this country was this country. The woman that's done the most work on this, by the way, if you're interested, Sylvain Diouf. Sylvain is just this amazing, amazing woman who teaches the Schomburg Center for Black Culture, phenomenal, phenomenal scholar of enslaved African Muslims. And these are just some of her books. The top one reproduces that image of Job bin Solomon, but others as well. If you go to the Library of Congress this year just made available digitally the Omar ibn Said archives. Omar ibn Said, another African Muslim slave who actually left an autobiography in Arabic. And so if you go on the Library of Congress page, they've done a great job as part of their digital humanities thing of putting it up there. So you can see the original Arabic. If you don't read Arabic, they have a translation. There's like 30 other things associated with this other Muslim slave, Omar ibn Said. But these are some of the books that Sylvain has written about Muslim slaves. You know, the preponderance, we don't have any slave narratives that are extant, meaning Muslim slave narratives that are written by women. But of course, women were slaves as well. Muslim women. This is a film that came out in 1991. Really, really interesting film, Daughters of the Dust, that many people may not have seen. If you're a movie fan, you would have seen this. Julie Dash was the director of the film, and in 1991, this film, Daughters of the Dust, was the first wide-release film in this country that was directed by an African-American woman director. You know, we talk these days about issues of diversity in films and how many women and people of color, you know, direct films. It's been an issue for quite some time. So in 1991, Julie Dash does this film. Very few people go to see it. In 2016, on the 25th anniversary of the film gets a major sort of re-release. Nothing to do with Julie, but because in 1991, when the film showed a young girl in Houston, African American, whose mom took her to see this film because this was the first major release by an African American woman director. And this idea of this woman taking her daughter to say, hey, you can do these kinds of things. That little 10-year-old girl who saw the film in 1991, Beyonce Knowles. If you know Beyonce, if you know Lemonade, ask your grandkids, they'll tell you a little bit about, about some of that. You know, I'm expecting, although you can surprise me, I'm expecting many of you aren't Beyonce fans, but you never know. You could well be. But this film that she made this record, Lemonade, in 2016, that had a film that came with it that actually had scenes from this film. You know, that's, I think, what got it the publicity, because people went back and said, wait a minute, what's Beyonce putting in this film? Why is she doing this? When you think about it, well, it's obvious. You're a 10-year-old, you see a film by an African-American woman, and you start thinking, hey, maybe as an African-American woman, I can do some creative things there as well. So Julie's film is great because, again, the whole point of this being that you know, we don't have the slave narratives, the Muslim slave narratives we have are all by men. We don't have any slave narratives by women. Doesn't mean there weren't obviously women who were slaves. We know this. I mean, George Washington, you know, when General Washington dies and his property is divided up, including his slaves, you know, in the list, Fatima and little Fatima. We assume little Fatima is the daughter of Fatima, and it's like, coincidence, or is this a Muslim slave? You know, we saw, and I remember I was in, one of the times I was teaching in Annapolis, they put me up at the Governor Calvert House, which is the mansion that sort of looks across to the Maryland State House, and they were doing some renovations. It was really lovely because they'd found, you know, things as they're doing renovations in the basement of this mansion in Annapolis, and one of the things they found was a hand of Fatima worn by a Muslim slave. You know, those are the kinds of objects, the things that we know that these slaves would have worn. And so the fact that, you know, General Washington, probably perhaps had Muslim slaves. You know. If you don't know these folks, you certainly know this fine young gentleman. You know. Our third president, Mr. Jefferson. I'm actually going to D.C. on Thursday, and I'm hoping on Friday to have a little bit of time to go, which I often do, you know, if I'm in D.C., to go to the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. Those are sort of places of pilgrimage, I suppose, you know, for me. And you think of Mr. Jefferson, who's able to, unlike many of us, essentially write his own epitaph. What are the things you want to be remembered for? Well, Mr. Jefferson's case, founding of the University of Virginia, the writing of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and a little thing we call the Declaration of Independence. And I think, what have I done with my life? You know, I say to my students, this is the pre-internet world. You can actually do things if you didn't spend time on social media. I mean, think about this for a second. Any one of those things, you founded the University of Virginia. You wrote the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom that essentially became the basis of our First Amendment. And then you wrote the Declaration of Independence. Amazing, amazing kinds of things. As Mr. Jefferson is working on all these things, in 1765, he buys a Quran. This Quran. This is actually Mr. Jefferson's Quran, now in the Library of Congress. I'm smiling because one of my mentors, Jane McAuliffe, phenomenal scholar of the Quran, amazing woman. She, at the time, was the director of the Kluge Center, the visitor center at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress isn't just the world's best library. It's one of the world's best research centers because of all the artifacts, the things that they have. And so for me, as a bookish person, to literally like hold in your hand something that Mr. Jefferson held in his hand in 1765, very powerful kind of moment. And Mr. Jefferson was a very, very smart man. Many of you know that the Library of Congress is really based on his library that he sold in the 1820s. He sold it for $28,000. And I'm thinking, that's a lot of money now. What would $28,000 have been like in the 1820s? You know, why does this man have a Quran? Well, Mr. Jefferson was no fan of Islam. I'm not saying that at all. You know, I'm not a huge fan of religion, I think, if we look sort of deeply. But when you're doing this kind of work, writing the Declaration of Independence, having a comparative background, he knew, you know, English law. He had familiarity with French law. What's the other law? Well, Islamic law, because this is the 18th century, you know. And so he wanted to learn about that. So he picks up a Quran, you know, 1765, before America's America, before he's our third president. He has a Quran. You know. He begins then, because he realizes what he's working with is a translation. It's the George Sale translation, in Arabic. Maybe I should teach myself Arabic, Mr. Jefferson figures. Slight problem, no Arabic tutors. Yeah. Mr. Jefferson, as I said before, very smart man. He's got a copy of Galen, this Greek medical text that's bilingual in Greek and Arabic. He knows the Greek. You figure out where I'm going from this. He begins to teach his own Arabic from the Greek. If you look at the archival work, it wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. And you think, like, how does that work? How does one man be able to do those kinds of things? But the fact that, you know, here you have the man that will become our third president, you know, the man that wrote the Declaration of Independence, owning a Quran, starting to learn a little bit of Arabic. Well, the history is an interesting one between America, meaning America as the country when it comes into existence in 1776, and Muslims. President Obama, in his remarks, mentioned this treaty in 1797. This is the actual treaty, but this is the text that he talks about. Really interesting here, 1797. Interesting first line in that Article 11 is the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Interesting thing there. As it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims. That was the term meant for Muslim. And the said states have never entered any war or any act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation. That was part of the misunderstanding of Islam there, to think that Muhammad was for Muslims like Jesus was for Christians, and so Islam is something called Mohammedanism, not Islam. But here's this treaty that talks about Islam and Muslims. So there's a history here, sometimes a controversial history, sometimes a very painful sort of history. Many people aren't aware that the oldest war memorial we have in this country is this one. The Tripoli Monument, the Libya Monument. Ignore the handsome young man who's there underneath. He's really there to show you the scale of the place. It's now in Annapolis. It's called sometimes the Libya Monument, the Tripoli Monument. It was carved in 1804 in Italy after the war against the Barbary Coast pirates. That was actually the first war we fought as a country. I mean, of course, we fight the Revolutionary War against Britain, but once we're a country, where do we engage? What's this war against the Barbary Coast pirates? All of a sudden, that line in the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. I remember reading that going, halls of Montezuma, I get that. We're a couple hours from the Mexican border. I understand where that comes from. Shores of Tripoli, why are we singing about Libya? Well, this is why we're singing about Libya. We fight this war, the Barbary Coast pirates. If you saw the recent Tom Hanks film, Captain Phillips, Somali pirates, they've been pirates in those waters as long as ships have plied those waters. And you had all sorts of issues there. After we defeat when we were a colony of Britain, Britain pays our essentially tax to the pirates to keep the shipping lanes open. Once we defeat Britain and get our independence, Britain's not in any position to pay our levies. We don't have any money to pay those levies, so we reconstruct the Navy, to fight these pirates. This may well be some of the first images of Muslims in the U.S. This was brought in, it was carved in 1804, brought in 1806 to the Navy Yard in D.C., then moved from the Navy Yard to the Capitol building and put in front of the Capitol building. In 1860, I think, is when it moved to where it is now, the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And you see that stereotypical image of the Turk. You see the scimitars, the crossed swords, the men with the mustaches, the turbans. These are some of the images. So remember, this came to America in 1806. You're seeing this here. Islam has been in the historical consciousness of Americans for literally centuries here. You see it in all sorts of ways. You all know this building here. Many of you know this. In the book, I talk about a friend of mine who, international student from Pakistan, came to USC to study architecture. USC is one of the finest schools of architecture in the country. He happened to be a Muslim, and he knows that there's a mosque across the street from USC. And so he goes across Jefferson to this place, which he thinks is the mosque, because it kind of looks like a mosque. Tries to open the door. Door's locked. And he's pulling on the door, and he's thinking to himself, what kind of mosque is closed on a Friday afternoon? This is the time that it should be open. He's sort of yanking the door hard enough that he attracts the attention of one of the security guards, who comes around the corner and says, excuse me, sir, can I help you? He says, well, I'm trying to get in the mosque for Jummah prayer. Sir, this is not a mosque. What do you mean this is not a mosque? Oh, this is a mosque. No, sir. This is the Shrine Auditorium. What's the Shrine Auditorium? It was built in the 1920s by the Shriners. Who are the Shriners? That's a long story. The mosque you're looking for is across Vermont. So if you know the USC campus, you know what I'm talking about. Across Jefferson, Shrine Auditorium. Across Vermont is the Masjid Umar, the mosque there. But you see this structure, meant to look for all the world like a mosque. The book is dedicated to two men. One I've talked about, Muhammad Ali. You all know Ali. The other person the book is dedicated to is this guy who you may not know on the left. You may know the young man with him on the top photo, Mick Jagger. If you're a Zeppelin fan, you know the young man with him in the bottom photo. It's Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. This is Amit Erdogan, who died in 2006. Emmett Erdogan came to this country in 1934 because his father, Mehmet Munir Erdogan, was the second ambassador of the Republic of Turkey to America. So this is a Turkish-born Muslim kid who comes to America. His father, before he'd become the ambassador to the U.S., was the ambassador to Great Britain. The Court of St. James's, as the British so lovely call their ambassador place. And so imagine being a young kid in London and then coming to D.C., which was a much more provincial town in the 1930s than it is now. So he's a young kid, but he's sort of interested in music. He goes into the black neighborhoods, especially by Howard University, starts listening to what in the 30s and 40s is race music. Black people listened to it. White people didn't listen to that music. His father dies, and he actually went to St. John's in Annapolis, and then was at Georgetown in school when his father dies. And so the question comes up, does he go back to Turkey with his family? Or having lived in America for a decade, does he want to stay in America? He decides to stay in America. With a small loan, $10,000 from their dentist, he and his Jewish friend, Jerry Abramson, found Atlantic Records. I would say that you cannot, and I'll be very careful here, that you cannot understand the history of America in the 20th century without taking Atlantic Records into account. Not the history of American music, but the history of America. The R&B sides that Atlantic Records did. They signed Ray Charles to Atlantic Records. Emmett wrote Mess Around for the Genius. The soul sides in the 60s. Booker T and the MGs, Otis Redding, all those sort of sounds. And then signing, Rolling Stones had their own record company, Rolling Stones Records, but it was distributed through Atlantic Records. He signs Led Zeppelin to Atlantic Records. He's one of the key people behind the building of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's the chairman of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He wins a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Library of Congress. It's basically a national treasure. American Muslim, Turkish background. And you see that in music to this day. You may not listen to these folks, but your grandkids do, the rap and hip hop. You know, RZA from Wu-Tang Clan, Busta Rhymes, Yasin Bey, Talib Kweli, Lupe Fiasco, African-American Muslims. And if you listen to rap and hip-hop, there's a really interesting Islamic subculture that comes through that. Comes through Nation of Islam, comes through Five Percenters, this breakthrough group, breakout group from the Nation of Islam. We can talk more about that. Women as well. Hijabi women, you know, misunderstood from Queens. You know. Not just in music, but you think about, you know, American Muslim women more recently. 2016, Ibtihaj Muhammad wins a bronze medal at the Olympics for the saber. First American Muslim woman who wears a hijab to win a medal for our country, a bronze medal. Following year, she gets a Barbie. Barbie has this line, who knew, because I don't know about Barbie, so you start researching this. Barbie has this line called Sheroes, and there's all sorts of issues about, you know, Barbie and images of women and representations. Let's put that aside for a second. But this idea of, as a young woman, she didn't see black Barbies in hijab. Now all of a sudden you have a black Barbie wearing the hijab. It's perfectly fine to do that, because that's one of the great things about America. You can dress the way you want to dress here. And so you see these interesting kinds of things. I want to touch on that for a second, because I know there's a lot of questions and issues here around this idea of hijab. In the Quran, the word literally doesn't mean veil, but a curtain, a partition. You know, the first hijab is literally how you divide a room, where you put a curtain in the room. It's the prophet's house. How does the prophet keep public space, private space where, so the women and children are public space where visitors are? That's where the first use of the term comes in. The Quran talks about scars, talks about men and women dressing modestly. Of course, it becomes men who are the guardians of women's modesty. You know, the Quran says explicitly, say to the believing men, lower your gaze, guard your modesty. Say to the believing women, lower your gaze, guard your modesty. The idea that A, you're supposed to encounter each other, B, when you do, lower your gaze, guard your modesty, dress modestly. So modest dress isn't simply for women, it's for men as well. If you look at some of the studies on this, and the Pew Forum, as an academic, you always want to say, when people say something, well, how do you know that? What's your source? Where's the data? Pew Forum on religion and public life, really good source for some of this data. And this is an interesting poll, not here in the US, but across the Muslim world. And you see the stuff there. I'm not going to go into the great detail there, but you see the different ways in which women dress, from the strict sort of, burqa in Afghanistan, to the more, the niqab, the face veil, the more full veil, the covering, and then lack of any kind of head covering, and asking, what's the most appropriately dressed woman? It's sort of interesting that you see the thing at the bottom, that it's across the Muslim world, it's actually woman number 4, not woman number 1, that's seen as, the appropriate sort of style of dress. In Lebanon, it's woman number 6 without the hijab. In this country, about half of American Muslim women wear the hijab, the head covering. About half don't. Great diversity here. So the hijab, and again, we can get into this in the Q&A, doesn't just simply mean the head covering, doesn't simply mean the full sort of burqa, the way you see it there. A couple more things, and then we'll finish up and throw it open to you. This is a really interesting slide. This comes from a study that the Pew Research Forum did in 2017. You hear all sorts of things about American Muslims being un-American. That's not true if you ask American Muslims. I'm proud to be an American. 92% of American Muslims agree to that. I'm satisfied with the way things are going in life to 80%. And remember, this is 2017. This is not 2000 or 2008 or something. This is 2017. Most get ahead with hard work. And interesting, has someone expressed support for you? About half. American people generally are what? Towards Muslims, friendly. Over half say friendly. Others neutral. So really interesting kinds of things here. Without getting into it, again, we can do this in the Q&A, commonalities here. Many people are surprised at some of these commonalities. Mara mentioned that one of the things I do is I've worked on Story of God with Morgan Freeman, 3 seasons on National Geographic Channel. That was actually one of Mr. Freeman's pet projects. He got the idea for this when he was in Turkey. I think he was filming one of the Chris Nolan Batman films. He was on location in Turkey, and he's a very smart man. And so on his day off, he gets a tour, and he goes to Hagia Sophia, built as this great Byzantine church when Istanbul was Constantinople. And then the Muslims take over, this church becomes a mosque, Constantinople becomes Istanbul, and he's getting a tour of this place, Hagia Sophia. And in the dome, as a Byzantine church, of course, there's icons. Those who knew the Byzantine architecture, you can't have Byzantine architecture without the icons. There's an icon of Jesus and Mary, but it's still up there. And Mr. Freeman says to his tour guide, he says, well, wait a minute. That's Jesus and Mary up in the dome. Yes, sir. He says, well, you told me that this was built as a church, so I understand why the Byzantines, Greek Orthodox Christians would have put icons of Jesus and Mary. Why did the Muslims keep the image of Jesus and Mary once they took it over? And the tour guide said, well, Mr. Freeman, you have to understand, Jesus and Mary are important figures for Muslims. And Mr. Freeman said, oh. I'm not going to try to do the voice because I can't do the voice. And that's actually his voice. That's the thing that annoys me. That's his speaking voice. That's how he orders lunch. Like, you think with actors, that's their sort of made-up voice when they act. That's how he talks. Oh, I did not know that Jesus and Mary were important to Muslims. Then he thinks, if I didn't know something that basic, what else don't I know about Islam or about religion? Let me do this TV series that talks about religion. So those commonalities, that Jesus is an important figure, Mary is an important figure. The Quran is not a book at all about the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran is really a book about Moses. The prophet mentioned most by name in the Quran is Moses. The archetypal story in the Quran, Moses and Pharaoh. The Exodus story. Here's God's prophet, Moses. Here's humans who are in opposition to God's message, Pharaoh. Really, really powerful kind of thing there. But we don't think about those commonalities between either Muslims and Christians or Muslims and Jews. My book actually begins, even though it's a story about American Muslims, with an event in 2015 at Ikar. I was actually just this morning for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. I couldn't go the first day because I teach on Mondays, but I was there today for the second day. Sharon Brous, who's a rabbi there, phenomenal woman, and she invited me to come there, years ago when we first met. 2015 on Rosh Hashanah, 1,000 Jews in this place. They worship at Shalavet, the Orthodox high school in Fairfax. I'm the only Muslim in the crowd. Sharon's sermon, 2015, is why American Jews should accept more and not fewer refugees. Because, of course, in 2015, it's a Syrian refugee crisis. Really, really interesting kinds of things there. Couple more things, and like I said, then I'll finish. This one is sort of interesting. We look at religious discrimination and say, who faces religious discrimination? Again, pure form. And you see the two columns. One, a poll they did in 2016, one, a poll they did this year, 2019. And it's sort of fascinating. Across the board, when you poll people and say, is there a lot of discrimination? Is there some discrimination? Muslim stays almost constant, 57% versus 56% this year. Say there's a lot of discrimination. You're not going to say it's not Muslims say this, it's people say there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims. Interesting, the increase in discrimination against Jews. 24% of people say there's just a lot of discrimination against Jews. 18% say there's a lot of discrimination against evangelicals. So really interesting here about discrimination. Another thing from the Pew Forum, which I think is fascinating. If we look at American Muslims, we really use that technical term, bimodal distribution. 24% of American Muslims have a household income of over $100,000. That's actually higher than the general non-Muslim public. Those Muslims you may know about: doctors, lawyers, engineers, business owners. I speak all the time across the country, and oftentimes when I'm speaking, people will say, we want to do some interfaith dialogue with Muslims, but there's no mosque in our town. And I'm like, is there a hospital in your town? Because there's probably some Muslim doctors. Check the cardiology wing. For some reason, we're drawn to cardiology. I don't know why, but go there. There's a university here, obviously. I'm speaking at this university. Is there an engineering department? Because there's probably some engineering professors who are Muslim. Is there a chamber of commerce? Because 25% of American Muslims own their own business. That's the success story part of the American Muslim community. But look below. 40% have a household income under $30,000 a year. So we're not just the wealthy professionals. Some of us are working class, struggling to get by here. Not that far away from here, in Santa Ana, the Cham community. These Muslims from a region between like Cambodia and Vietnam, who have historically been Muslim, who've come here. Really interesting kinds of things. So you get interesting diversity among American Muslims. Who are American Muslims? It depends. A third are people like me, South Asians. I was originally born in Pakistan, so people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. A quarter of us are African American. People who've been American for generations. A third of us are Middle Eastern. And in this town, Middle Eastern could be Iranian, Turkish, Arab, all sorts of differences there. There's 1,000 Latino Muslims in Los Angeles, which is very small with the millions of Latinos there, but it's a not insignificant number. They do their Ramadan services and the sort of Eid at the mosque by USC. And Cesar Dominguez is the imam there. If you saw Cesar walking down the street and you saw, oh, that's Cesar Dominguez from Mexico, you probably wouldn't say, bet that guy's a Muslim. What's an American Muslim look like? They could look like me. They could be a white American person. They could be a Mexican American person. They could be a black American person. Again, the Pew Forum says, if you look at, I didn't bring the slide up, but if you look at ethnically diverse congregations, the two most religiously diverse congregations in terms of ethnicity in the U.S., Seventh-day Adventists and Muslims. Really interesting there. So you see that diversity here. But I'll end with someone that you may not think of me ending with. Merle is not a Muslim, by the way. He is a Californian from Oildale, near Bakersfield, died the same year, 2016, as Ali. And I've been thinking about Merle because of the Ken Burns country series there. Full disclosure, may surprise some folks, I am a country music fan. All seriousness. I end the book talking about why American Muslims are Merle Haggard. I think the greatest country singer ever, songwriter, no dispute, line under his name, Hank Williams Sr. We're not Hank. Are we the prophetic voice that was Johnny Cash? No. Are we the songwriter that was Chris Christopherson? No. Are we the sort of outlaw country that was Willie Nelson? No. We're Merle Haggard, I think. I'll let you read that. We cannot, to put it simply, imagine, understand American music without Merle's contributions. In that sense, American Muslims are Merle Haggard, part of the fabric of American life. You may not think about us, you may not like us, you may not listen to us, you may go through periods where you distrust, even despise us. We might live in a major metropolitan center, perhaps in a relatively unimportant part of the country. I put that in scare quotes. Maybe wealthy, but we also come from humble, working class roots. I'm not saying we're the most important or the most influential group in America. What I am saying is that it would be a very different and poorer country without us. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. You said you teach on Monday night. Could you give us an idea of the demographics of your students?
Sure.
And how your experience has been in the classroom, whether they're getting it, and some information you can share about that?
Thank you for that. So when I came, I grew up in Canada, kindergarten to PhD, came to the U.S. in '97. I first taught at Cal State Northridge, so I taught for 8 years in the Cal State system. And that was pretty, I'll get to you, this is all part of your answer to your question. In those days, my students knew very little about Islam, whether they were Muslim or not. These are the pre-9/11 days, Post 9/11, my students came in thinking they knew an awful lot about Islam, but almost everything they knew was wrong, because they got it from the TV. So I had to start, not with a book. I started my classes between 97 and 2001 with Frank Peters' book, Muhammad and the Origins of Islam. Frank's long retired now from NYU, phenomenal scholar. That book is a great book. You want to understand Muhammad and the Origins of Islam, get Frank's book. He's a non-Muslim, sort of critical, secular historian, sort of looking at, what do we know about Muslim history, not from Muslim sources, but, objective historical kinds of things. Post 9/11, I had to start with Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death about the media and media culture and what that means. I moved in 2005 to Loyola Marymount University, which was an odd thing for me because I'm not Catholic, I'm not Christian, Went to this big state school, almost every university in Canada except for literally one are state institutions, So to teach at a small place, to teach at a Catholic place, to teach at a private place, very different. So LMU, about 6,000 students. The majority are Catholic, but only about half. About half are Catholic, the rest are other kinds of Christians. We've got a couple hundred Jewish students. We have a halal on campus. We've got about 150 Muslim students on campus. About 20 to 30 of whom are Americans. About 100, 120 or so are international students there. The diversity is across the board. So 70% of our students are from California, 25% are from the rest of the U.S., and 5% are international students. The thing that gets me, and this is the long way of starting with the teaching at Cal State Northridge at CSUN, is that they're all very young. So my class on Mondays is a freshman class, a freshman seminar there. And so I said to the students, I don't want to know the answer to this, but I have to know the answer to this. How many of you were not born when 9/11 happened? A third of them put up their hand. Then I said, how many of you were 1 year or less when 9/11 happened? The rest of them put up their hand. So that's the thing. So these are kids for whom 9/11 is Pearl Harbor. It's a historical thing. It happened before they were born. And so trying to explain some of those kinds of things. What's fascinating is that many of the students, especially as 70% of them are from California, know people who are Muslim. In this particular class, there's a couple of, it's funny because it's actually a class on Islam in America, and so you often have Muslim students taking the class because they think it's going to be an easy A. They're sorely disappointed, in the same way that I tell the students, look, just because you speak English doesn't mean you're going to get an A in an English class, But, a couple of the kids are American Muslim kids, a couple of the kids are international kids, a couple of Kuwaiti kids, one kid from the Emirates there. And so I think for them, they don't know this history, because they have not been taught this. For the international students especially, because they don't know American history to begin with. I grew up in Canada, and in Canada you learned American history. You don't learn that in other places there, but a really interesting mix there of the students. And they're generally receptive because I think for the students I stress, and this went back to teaching at CSUN, the importance of religious literacy. You may be religious, you may not be religious, but there's lots of people in California who are religious. Learn something about that. So that when there's a Hindu temple on your street, or your boss is a Buddhist, or your girlfriend is Jewish, or your best friend is Baha'i, how do you make sense of that? And so for many of them, especially those that come from a religious background, they know something about their own tradition, but they want to learn something about other people's traditions. Thank you.
We as Americans are taught in school all about the great contributions to history, to medicine, to science that the Europeans in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century have done. If you know history, you know that all of their work is based on Muslim work of 600 and 700 years before. Why is there not a concerted effort by the Muslim community to see that Americans learn that all of this stuff that we think Europeans were so bright about started with Muslims?
Yeah, that's a great question there. And I think there's starting to be a little bit of that. So a couple of years ago, there was this really interesting exhibit that was like in LA, it was in Dallas, it's only been a couple of major cities, looking precisely at Islamic science and exactly that kind of thing. Like, if you study the history of science, if you study philosophy, the kinds of things that made Descartes' thinking possible were Ibn Sina, Avicenna, Ibn Rushd, Averroes. One of my great heroes is Father David Burrell. David's a Holy Cross priest. He's in his, I was going to say he's in his mid-80s, but that's a young man for some of you here. David's not doing all that well health-wise, so keep him in your prayers, those of you who pray. But David's this Holy Cross priest, theology professor at Notre Dame, fairly conservative, sort of place. He was a scholar of Aquinas. And for him, it was this understanding of, wait, if I really want to try and understand Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Catholic thinker, I've got to understand the people he was in dialogue with. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, Maimonides. And so David sort of turns himself not into a Islamic and Jewish philosopher, you can't do that, but learning that, studying that, understanding that becomes really important. I think for American Muslims, talking about some of that history is important, doing some of those kinds of, exhibitions, that kind of thing. The art, I was actually in, what day is today? Last week, Oklahoma, in Tulsa, to give a talk at the Philbrook Museum, which organized for the first time a showing of Islamic art that came from a collection in Newark. Here in Los Angeles, we have probably the third best collection of Islamic art. The best collection in this country is at the Met. The second best collection is the Smithsonian. The third best collection is the LA County Museum of Art. It's because of all the renovations there, it's sort of on the shelves there. So in a couple of years, when Linda Komaroff, who's the senior curator, opens that up again, that'll be great. But I think exactly that kind of thing. The Ismaili Muslim community has been really good about doing interfaith work, not through academic stuff, but through music. Bringing in musicians and the kinds of music that comes from the Islamic world. But I think absolutely doing that kind of outreach. When I was talking about the demographics of American Muslims as doctors, lawyers, engineers, I always say it's true. Muslim mothers are Jewish mothers. There's 4 possible careers. You can be a doctor, You can be a lawyer, you can be an engineer, you can be a business owner, and there's no fifth option. My mother to this day, bless her, says, Beta, son, you're so smart, you could be a doctor. And I'm like, I am a doctor, I have a PhD. No, Beta, a real doctor, the kind that helps people. And so you're struggling with that. Where I'm going with this is whenever I speak to the Muslim community, this is exactly to your point, I tell the Muslim parents, cover your ears, because you're not going to want to hear this. We have enough doctors and lawyers and engineers. We need writers. We need storytellers. We need filmmakers. We need journalists. If we don't tell our stories, who's going to tell those stories? When this book came out, it was 2016, I was really privileged to be on a couple of talk shows, one of which was with Octavia Spencer, wonderful, wonderful actor. This is when Hidden Figures had just come out. So many of you have seen that film, where Octavia Spencer is in that role of the black woman that basically did the math to help get John Glenn in space. And Octavia tells this story of when she got the script for Hidden Figures, she thought, this is great, it's fiction. And then realizes, oh no, this is real. Black women did the math to help get John Glenn in space. And then says, I'm a black woman, and I don't know this story. If I don't know this story, why do I expect anyone else to know this story? It's exactly to your point. That's, I think, the challenge for Muslim communities, telling those stories, both the historical, past, but the contemporary kinds of things as well.
The relationship between Moses being mentioned so often in the Quran. I'm Jewish. I was told that, in fact, it goes back further than that in fact, Abraham was the father of Ishmael and Isaac, and Ishmael became the Arab part, I'm sorry, and Isaac became the Jewish part. And so I just would mention that. I think it's true. Secondly, we're here as concerned citizens, and I'm a concerned citizen. I thought you might have mentioned what's going on in the United States now in terms of the fact that the first two Islamic Congress women are told to go home to their countries, and I'm very concerned about that.
Thank you for that. So two things there. One, absolutely. And so for Muslims, Islam is not a new religion. Muhammad is not the first prophet. He's the last in a long line of prophets. Absolutely, as you said, the Abraham story is crucial. I say this all the time, Muslims face in the direction of Mecca, when we pray. Mecca is not important to Muslims because this is where Muhammad was born, even though this is where Muhammad was born. Mecca is not important to Muslims because this is where Muhammad got the first revelations in 610, even though this is where Muhammad got the first revelations. Mecca is important because this is where Abraham and Ishmael build the house of God, the house of prayer, the Kaaba. That goes back exactly as you said. And that story that if you're Jewish or Christian, Genesis 22, the Abraham story, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, but that before that, exactly that same story of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Hagar, Ishmael. Once Ishmael is born, Sarah kicks out Hagar and Ishmael. The Bible doesn't really tell that story other than that one thing at the end of the Abraham story where it says that Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael together bury their father. It doesn't say what happens when Ishmael gets kicked out. The Islamic tradition picks up on that and says when Ishmael gets kicked out with Hagar, they go to Mecca. Abraham comes to visit. He and Ishmael built this place. So absolutely, going right back to Abraham. The second point I think is really important. President Obama in 2009 talked about, when the first Muslims elected to Congress. That was Keith Ellison. So we've had 4 Muslims now in Congress, like Keith Ellison first from Minnesota, Andre Carson from Indiana, and now most recently Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And just going back to when Keith Ellison was elected, and you know this if you're political junkies, I suppose, that when new members of Congress are elected, there's a sort of public swearing-in ceremony. The Speaker of the House sort of does the sort of swearing in, but then in private they can do sort of what they want. And Keith Ellison's the first Muslim elected to Congress, wanted to be sworn in on a Quran. People went mad. You can't be sworn in a Quran, you have to be sworn in a Bible. And I'm like, no, you don't have to be sworn in a Bible because that would be a religious test. And one of the things that makes this country is that you don't have to belong to a religious tradition to hold office. You can do that here. And so, I'm sorry, I'm intimidated because I just noticed who's sitting beside you there. So, Bob, lovely to see you here. So, this whole moment here where when Keith Ellison says, okay, let's go across the library, let's go across the Library of Congress and get Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Can you be sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran? Now, maybe that's a different kind of thing, but even there. So this goes back, this is not I guess what I'm saying is the stuff you're hearing now with respect to Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib is not a new thing. You heard that with Keith Ellison, who's from Minnesota, African-American, no doubt about his Americanness. Andre Carson from Indiana, no doubt about his, Americanness. Now you have Ilhan Omar, immigrant. And you would look and think, in another telling, that's an American success story. Here's this woman who comes as a refugee from Somalia, grows up in this country, and that's the great thing about this country. Anyone can grow up to be anything. I mean, of course, there's issues with that. I'm not being Pollyannish, but that you can do this kind of thing. That you can become a congressperson, Rashida Tlaib, from Michigan there. And then the kind of backlash that, no, you can't do this, or go back to where you came from, or this is un-American. You want to say, no, that's not un-American. That's America. That's the great thing about America. And that's really the defense that we have to have, to be able to say, look, that's what makes this country this country. I grew up in Canada, very liberal, progressive sort of place. I came here in '97 because I was fortunate. I got 2 jobs in 1997 when I finished my PhD. One was at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. One was at Cal State Northridge. If you spent a winter, as I have in Winnipeg, been there, done that, the thought of coming to not just America, but California. Every Canadian wants to retire someplace warm. I came out here, You're on a visa. That visa turns to a green card. I can say more about that later on. But I have a green card. But in 2013, I decided, no, I'm not going to go back to Canada. Every Canadian wants to retire someplace warm. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here. I want to actually be able to vote. Georgia, not so crazy about, but I want to be able to vote, And so I became, in 2013, a citizen, precisely because that ideal of the Constitution, is extraordinary. And I say as a Canadian, not, from Somalia where there's war, famine. Why would people want to come to from other countries to come here? Obviously, if there's war, famine, that kind of thing. Canada is a very nice, pleasant place, but the ideal of America, the ideal of the Constitution sort of resonates with me. And I think that's exactly the issue. When you have these women who I think are exactly living up to that ideal and then get criticized because they're critiquing sorts of things. And then the racial sorts of stuff. We are told to go home. In Ilhan Omar's case, you can understand a little bit. But she's born here. Where's she going to go? It's that sense of things. And then that sense of, as a citizen, aren't you a citizen? Once you're a citizen, you're an American. That's the great kind of thing about this country. But it's not about, not to go on at length here, but, when Charlottesville happened, the chant that really horrified me, and I have to be very careful when I say this, was not the Jews will not replace this chant. Of course that horrified me, but we've heard that. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, has been in this country for a long, long time. What horrified me was the blood and soil chants. Because that's not America. That's Europe. America isn't that you're American because of your lineage, birth. It's your allegiance to a document, the Constitution. That's what I swore an oath to, And I think that's the thing, that you're doing this. And you want to say to some of these people, have you read this thing, the Constitution? Have you paid attention to this thing? Because I don't think it says what you think it says there. But absolutely, that sense of, you're trying to do exactly the right thing. Get involved in the political process. Get elected to Congress. Try to make change there.
We had an interfaith ministries. It was very functional. It was Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Islamic, or Muslim, I'm sorry, I may have used the wrong word there.
Islamic.
And they worked together. The only mosque we had was in Garden Grove. And Dr. Siddiqui was a wonderful leader and brought the Muslim communities right in with it. And the only criticism that we had in those years was the fact that they had put painted lions and so forth on their gates, which they were used to from Egypt, and they were asked to repaint them. Otherwise, we really had a frictionless community between Muslim and the rest of the community. They worked together, and it was just a pleasure to be part of that ministry, not as being a minister, but being in support of it with the social and public clubs like Garden Grove Women's Civic Club and so forth were all somewhat integrated. So it really is a very wonderful experience.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that history. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, do you want to make a comment?
No, but that was a great comment there.
I had a question about the modern Muslim state and the impact, going back historically, that the Enlightenment has on European governments, and that's a secular government, a separation of church and state. Talk to me and all of us about separation of church and state in government.
And I think that's one of the great things about America, precisely, is that sense of freedom of religion. That you can do whatever religious tradition you want to practice. That happens in some places in the Muslim world, doesn't happen in all of them. And so part of if you look at, how is it that Muslims govern themselves? Well, the most populous Muslim countries, Indonesia first. That surprises people sometimes. The most Muslims in any country are actually Indonesia. Then it's probably Pakistan. Then it's probably India. Then it's probably Bangladesh. So you just look at those four countries. Indonesia, sort of democracy. Pakistan, more or less like a military dictatorship. I mean, so it's sort of a democracy, but it's really the military that sort of runs it. India, democracy where Muslims are a minority. Only about 10% of Muslims, actually of Indians are Muslim. Billion two, you got 120 million people there. Bangladesh, different sort of setting. Saudi Arabia, kingdom. Turkey, a republic. And so you have lots of different ways of expressing what it means to be a Muslim politically. Like John Esposito is probably the person that's written the most about Islam and politics, and that's one of the things he talks about, that there's no one way for Muslims to govern ourselves. You look at all these different countries, you have that kind of stuff happening there. In many ways, I think this is a way in which American Muslims can be of influence to other parts of the Muslim world, particularly our countries of origin. What do I mean by that? When the revolution happened in Egypt, and you had as part of that some of the violence against the Copts in Egypt, who are Orthodox Christians. One of the great moments in Los Angeles was at that point Dr. Maher Hathout, who was the founder of the Islamic Center of Southern California, Egyptian, was still alive, and he went down to St. Mark's, which was the Coptic cathedral, and stood with Bishop Gerges, and to say, look, as an Egyptian, there's nothing Egyptian about, as an Egyptian Muslim persecuting Muslims. Here, after the beginning of the Iraq War, and then the sort of sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shias, you've got not that far away from here, one of the largest Shia centers, the Islamic Educational Center of Orange County, right by the John Wayne Airport. It's a Shia center. About 20%, 15-20% of the world's Muslims are Shia Muslims. About 30% of American Muslims are Shia Muslims because of places like Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and you've got those populations. So the Shia population is actually larger here in the U.S. than it is in the rest of the Muslim world. But where I'm going with this is that when you had that violence between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq, again, you had leaders, including someone mentioned Dr. Siddiqui from Garden Grove, from the Masjid al-Rahman here, Dr. Hathout, and then Imam Qazwini, who was the leader of the Shia community there, coming together and doing this kind of thing. Say, no, there's nothing in the Islamic tradition that says that Sunnis and Shias have to kill each other. Let's look at America, that's where I'm going, as the model for this. Let's look at that kind of freedom there. And so I think that becomes really important. My own view of that is shaped, of course, because I was born in Pakistan, grew up in Toronto, lived in LA now for going on 20 years. My experience of being a Muslim is in the minority, not in the dominant context where you can sort of control the discourse there.
Hi. When you talked about the Muslim Congress people, it brought to mind that there are communities in this country with large numbers of Muslims. I don't know where they are or what they have contributed to those areas, and I would like to.
Yeah, and it's all over the place. So, without getting too fine into it, like the first Muslims that came over, as I mentioned in the slideshow, were African slaves. After that, it was a lot of people from what was then like the Ottoman Empire. Farmers coming in, laborers brought in. The first mosque that we know of built as a mosque in this country was actually built over 100 years ago in Portland, Maine. There's a guy who had a textile mill in Maine, and he brought in Albanians, because apparently Albanians are good at working with textiles. Who knew this? We don't think of Albania as a Muslim country, and yet Albania is a Muslim majority country. So in 1912, these Albanians are brought in. 1915, they build this thing in Maine. So you have communities that come out of the Ottoman Empire, communities that come out of the Arab world in cities, let's say, like Dearborn or so. In East Coast cities, particularly like New York, New Jersey, much more South Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi sorts of Muslims. Here in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, I know I'm not in Los Angeles, it's the LA thing where you assume everything is LA, so forgive me for saying that. I catch myself too late. Here in Southern California, Iranian Muslims. Now Iranians, of course, are Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, secular, whatever. But you have large Iranian populations here doing that kind of work, and you see all sorts of things. Like for many Muslims, we came over talking about this at dinner as students to come here to study. I talk in the book, I didn't mention it here, Fazl Rahman Khan, who came to this country to study engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, gets a job when he graduates with Skidmore, Merrill Owing. He's the structural engineer, he's a Muslim from Bangladesh, who comes up with the technology to build these very tall buildings. So, Sears Tower. I think it's the Willis Tower, something else now. I still call it the Sears Tower. John Hancock Building. Those are built because of this Bangladeshi Muslim guy who comes to this country, becomes an engineer, does that kind of thing. He develops that kind of technology. So that's the kind of, sense of what Muslims have done. Henry Ford, bringing in factory workers from the Arab world. And so you see concentrations of people in different settings. Here, not like right in Laguna Woods, but not that far away from here in Santa Ana, you see this community I mentioned, the Cham community. Who knew that in the 9th century there were Muslims in this kingdom that's sort of between like Cambodia and Vietnam, who side with the Americans during the Vietnam War, who, after that war is over, are ruthlessly persecuted because, of course, they sided with the Americans. Many of them come here. And so you have that community that's been here for going on 30 years now. But we often don't, that's the interesting thing about being a minority community. Oftentimes, you don't pay attention to minority communities, unless you're part of that community, but they're there, they're around.
I'm a fan of Spengler, and as a philosopher and so on, and in response to that lady's comments about the Arab culture at a time that was prominent in science and literature and so on, I just wanted to point out that it would appear from a number of things you said that Spengler was right, that the Arabic culture once blossomed a long time ago and died off. And once Muhammad came along and so on, became a very religious and almost anti-progressive culture. And that the people from those from that culture who have risen up have basically joined in the Western culture, have come here, gone to places like Trujillo and so on, and have then contributed as part of the Western culture.
We can talk more about that, but with all due respect, I would disagree with that a little bit, just because, all these things we're talking about in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries are after the coming of Islam, in that sense of establishing academies, doing that kind of thing. I mean, it's a spurious hadith that Muslims quote all the time of seek knowledge though you find it in China. This idea that the search for knowledge is incumbent upon Muslims, to go out there, to look at this. And that becomes really interesting if you look at like the translation movement, translating some of these Greek texts into Arabic. One of my teachers, extraordinary man, happened to be an Arab Christian. We forget that half the Arabs in this country are not Muslim; they're Arab Christians. Michael Marmora, phenomenal scholar who did a lot of work on Avicenna, Ibn Sina, because the work prior to Mike was really. People were saying, well, yes, the Arabs translated this, but all they did was translate. They didn't contribute anything new. And what Mike showed was, no. Here's the newness. Here's the kinds of things that they, in fact, had been able to contribute there. And so you see that in different places. And certainly, I think in the last couple of years, you see all sorts of issues and problems in many parts of the Muslim world. But I don't think it's that sense of not being not searching for knowledge. I think that's important.
I and the people in this room are very sympathetic with what you say, but the ugly fact is there is a lot of strong prejudice in this country against Muslims, and I guess that it's due to the fact that there are fanatics who are killing now tens of thousands of Muslims, and we're concerned that that will spill over to the billion Christians and we could have a terrible war. And it makes the world no fun. How can we work to ameliorate this problem?
So I think the short answer to that would give me a Nobel Peace Prize, and so I don't have that answer there. But I think, no, absolutely. I don't mean to downplay the issues of violence and the kinds of things that happen there. It's a question of do we see, first of all, the violence in our own society? So I came to, I'm smiling as I say this, I remember this wonderful kind of moment some of you would have known, Rabbi Harold Schulweis. I got to meet Rabbi Schulweis at Valley Beth Shalom in 98, because I'd come to CSUN in 1997. 98 is the 50th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, and I was involved with some work at Valley Beth Shalom. And we actually had some Israelis who in 1998 didn't want to come to America because it was too violent. And I'm like, Valley Beth Shalom is in Encino. There's not a lot of drive-bys happening here in Encino, but if you see this, and we think, Israel, I don't want to go there, I'd get blown up by terrorists. And here's Israelis going, and see America, those are crazy people. People ask me, are you afraid of ISIS? I'm like, no, I live in America. I drive the 405. That's a much more dangerous thing. I'm not diminishing the threat of ISIS, but it's not a threat here. We look at our intelligence services, we look at our military, we look at, the U.S. is doing just fine in terms of, protecting itself and doing those kinds of things there. If I'm in Syria, Lebanon, whole different story. If I'm in Iraq, whole different story. And absolutely, one of the things I think you mentioned was that, the number one target of Muslim extremists is other Muslims. Much more likely to kill someone who's a Muslim than someone who's a non-Muslim. But I think oftentimes, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think oftentimes we don't see the sort of violence that goes on all around us. I mean, we look at the 3,000 Americans, horribly, tragically, killed on 9/11, But do we think about how many people were killed in the Rwandan genocide? How many people are killed in the wars in Bosnia? How many people are killed in the civil war in the Congo and basically the border war between Congo and Burundi? Conservative estimate, 1 million? liberal estimate, 3 million. Let's go with the small one, 1 million people. None of the Congolese are Muslim. These are Christians, these are traditional African religions, and so I think oftentimes we look at that kind of violence, going back to what Wilfred said, do we see the realities of other people? Do we see that kind of thing? I don't think any religion has a monopoly on violence. I think lots of folks have done violent things. You look at, before the issue with the Rohingya, Muslim folks, you had issues in Myanmar a couple of years ago, and I was talking with my students. I was actually taking a world religions class at the time, and we were talking about how horrible it was that these government officials were beating up these Buddhist monks. And I'm like, you understand the government officials beating those Buddhist monks are also Buddhists, right? They're not atheists, they're not Christians, they're not Muslims, they're Buddhists. They're doing this kind of thing. You have that. We don't think of Buddhist violence. Our new chair of Catholic theology at LMU is this wonderful, wonderful woman, Nancy Pineda Madrid, and it was sort of a shot across the bow for us to hire her. Because A, she's a woman, B, she's a Latina, C, her first book was on the femicide in Ciudad Juarez. 2,000 women killed at the border. Al-Qaeda's not working there. ISIS isn't working there. These women are killed by Mexican men. Almost all of them were Christian. Most probably Catholic, but perhaps some Christians, And so I think that violence in religion, we can very easily tease out some of those things and say, these men that are killing these women, yes, they're religious, but they're not doing it out of religion, they're doing other kinds of things. Yeah, but their religion isn't stopping them from doing that killing either. And so I think that's really the thing, that we see the sort of complexity, of things. We look at that kind of violence and say, absolutely, how do we fight against that? What do we do? And this goes back to one of the earlier questions. For me, as a Muslim who's grown up in a minority culture, very much that sense of protecting other minority cultures. What can I do? Not just here in the U.S., but in other parts of the Muslim world, doing exactly that kind of work. But I think, again, that's the kind of stuff that if what you know of Islam is a picture of bin Laden. That's one of my students did this thing a couple of years ago, Arab kid, who sort of puts up a slide of Shirin Neshat, this amazing Iranian artist. No one knows who she is. Puts up a slide of Ahmed Zewail, Nobel Prize-winning chemist who just passed away a couple years ago at Caltech. No one knows who he is. Puts up a slide of bin Laden. Everyone knows who that is. If the only Muslim you know is bin Laden, of course you're going to think about the negative kinds of things. Not saying he wasn't a horrible man. Of course he was a horrible man. But do we think about the other kinds of folks? Do we understand that part of the world as well? Happy to stick around and talk, sign books, and talk to folks. So I saw some hands go up. So thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.